I'm an ER doctor and have ADD. I love doing all different kinds of things. So I love the opportunity to talk to the public, to get this message outside of academia. That was a TED Talk that was terrifying. I'll just say there were like 3,000 people and you don't get notes, and it was awful and wonderful at the same time. I'm also a very proud native Coloradan. I lived on the East Coast for a long time, went back home. The man on your right is my father-in-law, who is a gun owner for annual hunting trips. I'm not a gun owner myself, but understand why many people are. And I hope my daughters, when they're old enough, that they'll want to go out with Pops for a weekend as part of a sort of family tradition, and also to learn safe firearm handling. At the same time, I hold the perspective, as I think probably everybody in this room does, as a suicide loss survivor. Most recently, my cousin Ian died by firearm suicide after I'd already started doing this work, and I was really so angry, honestly, also with myself for not having done more to prevent his death, that I almost stopped doing this work, but then ultimately, and with input from his parents, decided this was perhaps the way I could help other families not go through the same pain. And I want to acknowledge, when I talk about suicide today and I talk about numbers, each one of those is a life lost. And so if at any point you need to leave for whatever reason, feel free to do so, and just make a scene and storm out, so it's dramatic at least. Just yell, "This is all garbage," or something. And so it was around the same time that Ian died was when my work with the firearms community was really taking off. And it was not my background, but I had an opportunity to step into spaces that were different for me, but I was able to really approach them with an open mind and really seeking for ways for us to collaborate together to prevent what no one wants, which is that nobody wants people dying by suicide. And we may have different political opinions, we may have different views on all kinds of things, including whether or not we think there should be guns in someone's home, but how do we work together to prevent those deaths? And so the other big disclosure tonight, in case you have not already picked this up, is that we're going to talk about both guns and suicide tonight, and I recognize both of these are controversial topics. I am not here to talk about gun laws. I'm not here to encourage you to buy guns. I'm not here to tell you not to own guns. So you can ask me about gun laws at the end, but I probably won't answer. The work that I do explicitly is nonpartisan for a reason, because we are trying to work in this space collaboratively. There's also a lot of ongoing stigma around suicide, and I recognize that. And my approach to this is that we're just going to lean into this, and we're going to do it. So if you came just for the food, I think there's some food still next door. Please feel free to step out. Or if you thought this was something else. And also, we planned this like a year ago, so this was not planned based on current events. I'll just say that also. Okay. So I promise this is not a stats-heavy talk, but I think it's good to get us all kind of on the same page. So when we think about suicide rates in the United States, they've been kind of slowly increasing, maybe plateaued a little bit in recent years, but the overall trend has been generally upwards. And you can see roughly that the bottom line, which is firearm suicides, is about half of all suicides. And that has remained true over time as well. So when we think about suicide in this country, about half of all suicide deaths are by firearm. And kind of over the same time period, we've seen this happen with car crash deaths. So I'm guessing almost everybody in here today got in a car at least once, right? We still drive a lot, and yet we've seen this dramatic decrease. And I work in the ER, I see tons of people in car crashes. Almost all of them go home right away. They're fine. And why is that? Well, we've done a bunch of things as a society. We've taken what's called a public health approach to try to understand and prevent both the crashes, but also the physical injuries, deaths, and long-term morbidity from cars. So we do things at the individual level, right? Like driver education and don't be distracted, don't use your cell phone while you're driving, like those kinds of things focused on changing a person's behavior. But we also focus on community and cultural norms. Friends don't let friends drive drunk. Thinking about sort of acceptable norms for the way you behave when if you're a driver or passengers, et cetera. And then in the environment and engineering, right? So we created better roads. Do you guys have runaway truck ramps here? That's like we have like, I'm gonna say it, we have like real mountains, no offense to you. I had to say that at least once. No, but runaway truck ramps were designed because they realized sometimes trucks, no matter how good your maintenance is, they're gonna lose their brakes. And we don't want people dying, so they figured out how to change the environment to make it safer. Airbags were invented recognizing like a crash is going to happen. How do we avoid having that energy transfer to the person? And so when the paramedics come in now after a crash, they show me a picture of the car, and the car's all crumpled up, but the person's fine. And that's because cars these days are designed to crumple. They absorb the energy so the person walks away. And then the environment also includes things like laws, right? So we have drunk driving laws, and we have speed limits, and we have traffic signals, and all of those things have contributed to the decrease in traffic deaths, despite there being more cars than ever and people driving more than ever. And so I think there are a lot of analogies here, and so I'm going to come back to the car safety analogy, because I think for me, it's very helpful when I think about how we approach firearms and firearm suicide prevention to sometimes draw analogies to things that we're more familiar with as culture change. Because what we also did with traffic safety was we made a lot of these things, like the behavior changes and the environmental changes, we made it normal, that nobody was singled out, right? You're not the weird one for asking who the designated driver is anymore. That's just normal. People just do that now. You're not weird for putting your seatbelt on. That's kind of expected. And we made it easy for people to do, because I think it can't just be about normalizing things. We've got to remove the barriers to someone doing kind of the right or the safe thing. And so these are the themes we're going to come back to. Okay, this isn't really a graph. This is just like an infograph. so when we, there are nearly 50,000 suicide deaths every year. And then, as I mentioned earlier, about half of them are by firearm, right? We know that where there are more guns in this country, there are more suicide deaths. And this is true also if you do comparisons across different countries. So countries that have more guns have higher suicide death rates. And that is true after you try to control for lots of other things like prevalence of mental illness. We know overall having a gun in the home increases the risk of suicide death by about threefold. But the gun is not what is causing the suicide, or the suicide attempt, in that the presence of a gun does not make a person in that household more likely to be suicidal. So this is really important. I think we can hold both of these things at once. It is true that when you have a gun in your home, it increases the likelihood of death, but it's not because the presence there is somehow changing human behavior. And before we go into kind of why that fact, that 3 times risk is there, I want to acknowledge that just reducing access to firearms is not going to fix the suicide problem. Suicide is a big and messy problem. Often we know there's preceding mental health issues, whether depression, PTSD, and so forth. Certainly also things like substance use, but we also know there's a lot of things like social stressors and often sort of everything piling on at once. And so we need all of these other things. We need better availability of care. We need to raise awareness and so forth. And we need postvention and treatment plans, and all of that. I'm not saying that people don't need to get the mental health care, that whatever it is they need for their situation. But what we're talking about here is this reducing access to means. So why does this matter? There are really 3 sort of main facts that you need to know to understand the rationale behind lethal means safety. So the first is that we know from research that the decision, from deciding to act to acting on suicide can be in the space of minutes to hours. So you can have years of depression, growing problems over months, weeks to months. But we know from survivors that from the time that they decided to take action to taking action can be minutes to hours. So it's really a short risk period that we're talking about. People sometimes describe this as suicide being impulsive. It's not impulsive like me at Target in the checkout line where I'm buying the random stuff from the, right? It's not that, it's that it's a short time window. We also know that people get better, and we need to stop thinking about even having suicidal thoughts or even a suicide attempt as a terminal diagnosis. I see a lot of things in the ER with much higher case fatality rates than suicide risk. We know of people who have suicide thoughts or behavior, and particularly suicide attempts, only about 10% later die by suicide. So that's a pretty good overall kind of outcome. And one attempt does increase your risk of future attempts, but again, it's not inevitable. So we need to start really emphasizing that suicide even suicidal thoughts is something that a person can get through. But if there is a gun in that dark moment and a person uses a gun for a suicide attempt, almost always they will die. In my career, some years now, I think it's almost 20 years now in emergency medicine, I've seen one person after a firearm suicide attempt, and he died in my ER. And the only thing I could do for him was to give his spouse time to sit with him before he passed away. And that's because people typically die where they pull the trigger. There is no second chance to be found and call for help. There's no chance for them to regret what they've done and call for help themselves. And we know that that's very different compared to other methods, particularly medication overdose. I see a lot of people who overdose on medications, and the vast majority of them do just fine. So some people will say, well, why does it matter if we reduce access to guns? They'll just find another way. Okay, first, we know generally that's not true because of that time window I was talking about. If people get through that time window, they find something that they can make them hopeful. Like maybe they remember, oh, but my grandbaby, I don't wanna, or I have that job interview or something. Even if they substitute a different method, they are less likely to die. So if they can't get to the gun and they down a bottle of pills, they are still more likely to survive than had it been the gun. And so these are really the three things that lead to that statistic I showed you about a gun in the home increasing the likelihood of suicide death. And it's because in that moment, if someone is not at their best or is in a dark kind of crisis, often there's alcohol impairment as well. If it's a gun, they're unlikely to survive. Okay. And so the message related to firearm suicide prevention broadly, and this has been for many years, although as we were talking about today with some different people, it still hasn't fully filtered into, say, medical education and so forth, is it's about reducing firearm access for those at risk of suicide. And it's very much like a designated driver. It's like a friends don't let friends drive drunk. Somebody's not at their best, they're not thinking the way they usually would. We don't want them to have access to a dangerous item until they get better. So for a designated driver, it's until they sober up the next morning. For suicide risk, it's getting whatever care they need, whatever crisis can pass. So it's typically kind of a longer time frame than just that one night. Okay, I'm gonna show you 3 videos tonight to give myself a break, and also because it's kind of, I think, interesting. Part of this talk is to show you some of the work that's out there. I will tell you this video has a gunshot in it. This is a video that was made from the Suicide Prevention Coalition in Utah.
Last year I was at my lowest, going through some pretty serious depression. A couple of friends of mine stopped by the house and said they were worried about me. Said they'd feel a lot better if they could hold on to my firearms until things turned around. I think they saved my life.
If your loved ones are struggling, talk to them about temporarily storing their guns away from their home, because things do get better.
So if you remember nothing else, remember that video and that guy. So he's the poster child in many ways for suicide prevention, firearm suicide prevention in this country in terms of the demographic who's at highest risk. But what did he say? It was about, he was in a dark period. His friends, so trusted people, came over, said, we want to hang on to your guns. And like clearly he got his guns back. So he didn't have to change his personality. It wasn't about confiscation. There was no police involved. This was about friends looking out for friends, family looking out for family. What's not said in this is what kind of help did he need, et cetera, what kind of help did he get. But I think this is the kind of messaging we're seeing coming out, which is great, because honestly, also, it's not the do-gooder ER doctor talking to you. It's somebody who maybe looks a little bit more like you, or somebody who you might trust a little bit more. And that's really important, certainly in terms of getting broad messaging out. So that's sort of message number 1, is it's like the designated driver piece. Somebody's at risk of suicide, we want to make sure they don't have access to guns. Here's the problem. How do you know that somebody's at risk of suicide, right? So it's easy if somebody says, I feel suicidal, can you take me to the ER? Okay, great. But how do we identify in the chaos of life the actual risk. And I know there's some psychiatrists in the audience, and if I asked you your ability to predict suicide, I'm guessing you're gonna say it's pretty low, actually, like on a moment to moment, right? Because we know it fluctuates, we know there's that sort of impulsive aspect. And we know that that guy, that poster child, like, I'm guessing he's not generally the type we would think of who would first be calling a hotline or asking for help, because there's still a lot of stigma around help-seeking behavior, particularly in certain populations, particularly among men. And so how do we reach the people who might be at risk, who maybe don't even realize it themselves yet, or who aren't willing to acknowledge it? And so that's where now a lot of our work is kind of moving upstream to try to think about how do we broaden messaging. Because if you only make it about suicide risk, a lot of people are gonna say, I would never do that, my teenager would never do that. And I can tell you, more kids die from firearm suicide, generally a parent's gun, than from any kind of school shootings or mass shootings every year in this country. And we don't want to talk about that, but we have to talk about it. I have teenagers. It's awful to think about. But we know that kids and teens die from suicide, and it's usually at home, and it's usually a parent's gun. And so how do we help parents understand that risk? And that in particular with teenagers, that risk is a crazy roller coaster, right? I mean, my teens at least, it's like, every day is this like emotional whiplash. So what do we do? And this is where I think the analogy is more like a seatbelt. You don't know what that day is gonna bring, or maybe it's like locking your car, but I like the seatbelt analogy. You don't know what that day is gonna bring, so you always wanna be storing guns securely, meaning locked up to prevent unauthorized access. What does unauthorized access mean? Really anyone who you don't want accessing your gun. I would advocate that should include teenagers, no unsupervised access because of the emotional lability. Even teens who've been trained in how to handle firearms safely. I think the overall safest approach for injury prevention is that they not be able to access guns. But it means the workman coming over to your house. It means somebody who's staying with you. It means anybody who might want to steal your gun and use it for criminal activity. It means your teenager's best friend who's over for the evening. It's really around framing this around a positive aspect of firearm ownership, which is responsibility in making sure that you are securing access to your firearm at all times. And what I'm gonna move into now is some of the approaches that we're using in all of these spaces. And again, around making it both normal and easy. And I'm gonna show a couple examples again from the kind of car safety world to hopefully get the ideas churning about what we could be doing in the firearm world. And I wanna emphasize, I think what we really need in this space is really broad cultural change. We're not there yet. Like when we think about secure storage being the norm, it is not the norm right now. Many people store their weapons securely at home, but many people still don't. And so this is what a lot of us now in the field are trying to do. Thank you for coming. Yeah. Okay, so when we think about cultural change, making it normal and easy. Okay. Okay, so, all right, I don't remember cars like this. I do remember I was a kid of the 80s. So I remember like being in the way back of the station wagon. I also remember sitting between my grandparents in their station wagon, like on the armrest in the front seat, that was a normal thing to do. Like that is crazy to me now, right? But remember how I was talking about engineering of cars? If you were in a car crash in this car on the left, that steering wheel would impale you and you would die, right? That doesn't happen anymore because we changed the cars. And this one is the best picture ever. This car apparently was marketed that the back dashboard was a cozy place for your baby to sleep while you were driving. That's insane, right? And we all laugh now because there's no way you could sell this, but that was a thing. And not in the 1960s, like not that long ago. And so this is the kind of cultural change I think we need to see happen. And if you read histories around traffic safety, initially the car makers, for example, didn't want to put seatbelts in their cars because they didn't think people would pay for them. And think about sort of where we're at now. So make it normal, right? So like, why is McDonald's talking about wearing seatbelts? Like it has nothing to do with McDonald's, but it's about capturing sort of these cultural moments, right? And I'm sure somebody paid them to do it. But Taylor Swift wearing a seatbelt, James Bond wearing a seatbelt, Prince William using a car seat. Like these are the kinds of things, right, as you start to get sort of cultural change. And so a lot of us are thinking about now sort of who are the like influencers in the firearm world, for example, and you'll see a video later, but how do you start to get these messages out in a way that's authentic, but is also recognizing different messengers are going to speak to different groups. I will say it was actually really hard to find pictures of celebrities wearing seatbelts because many of them don't, which is really bad. But anyways, James Bond does. So, but then you also have to make it easy. Who remembers these seatbelts that put themselves on? Oh my God, they were such a disaster. They were terrible. How like you would get in and then you still had to do the lap belt, but nobody would do the lap belt, so you'd like shoot under and still die in the crash. So it was a great idea, didn't quite work out, and we'll have some of those hiccups probably too. But that's an example, and this I think is fascinating, right? This is now, so Volvo was the first car they invented the seatbelt. An interesting story, actually then didn't basically patent it, and like he gave the design away to all car makers so that they could all use it because it was a safety thing. But car makers finally started sort of marketing safety as a way to get people to buy their cars. These are other examples of getting seatbelts installed for free at your gas station. So cool, $5.95 each. And then insurance discounts too. So we see this now also with like, you can get safe driver discounts if you don't drive over the speed limit. You have a little thing in your car that measures it. So what are the similarities in the firearm space? How can we incentivize making it easy for people to use safes and for secure storage? And one example is the military, I think now it's 2023, basically, when you PCS, when you move from one installation to another, you have a weight limit for how much of your household stuff you can move, and then you have to pay over it. And the Department of Defense said firearm storage devices don't count against that weight limit. Make it easy, right? So now, if you have a big gun safe that's super heavy, you don't have to pay to move it. And that's the kind of, and for a while the DoD was thinking about having firearm like safes basically standard in all military housing. Those are examples of how do we start to think about just making this like both easy and the normal and the easy thing for people to do. So then on the normal front, when we think about like designated driver stuff, right? So I mean, at least I remember when I was growing up, every sitcom had some episode about the designated driver and driving drunk and DUIs. And lots of messaging around it. And then, for example, the NFL being involved, right? So why is the NFL involved? Well, because people drink at NFL games, but it's good for their brand to be a good community service, but also might help some people kind of like listen, right? If they really like the NFL and they're like, oh, well, they're saying, so maybe I should do this. And then making it easy, so places that give like free sodas or free food to designated drivers, right? Bars that got involved in this. Certainly things like Uber and Lyft, I think were game changers. They didn't develop to help with drunk driving, but I think certainly have made it way easier than it used to be. And so what are the examples? And I'll talk through some. So these are a couple of the broad kinds of examples that we have right now. So you saw that one PSA I already showed around sort of normalizing things. Some of these messaging, so the one on the top was the Attorney General in Colorado did a whole campaign around secure storage. Some of these are VA and Department of Defense messaging around firearm storage. And this is not for your service weapon, but for personally owned weapons. You can see here, this is one of the women who helped develop that campaign in Utah. And so many of these things have been sort of happening ad hoc over years. There's something called the Gun Shop Project, which was started in New Hampshire, and it was public health professionals working with gun shops to basically put up educational materials for customers. So this one on the left was developed by the New Hampshire Coalition that started the first Gun Shop Project. So the 11th commandment, anyone want to guess? It's if someone's suicidal, make sure they don't have access to a gun. So these are the kinds of materials, though, that were given out to anyone coming in. They were at the front desk and so forth. So kind of a more passive educational approach, but a first step in this space of really what would have previously been seen as maybe two totally different fields coming together to figure out language and messaging and approaches that might be acceptable. This eventually grew into a partnership that my understanding took a couple of years to build up the trust. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, which is a phenomenal national nonprofit that does a lot of education, survivor support, outreach, as well as fund research, and the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the trade association for firearm businesses. So the NRA's members are people, individual gun owners. The NSSF's members are gun shops and ranges. And so they cover about 10,000 shops, I think, in the United States, but they are one of the major lobbyists in Washington as well when it comes to firearm issues and firearm rights. So they actually came together and put out a whole campaign that they sent to all of those independent gun shops around suicide prevention, kind of taking the gun shop project to a national scale, which was like, this is like 2018, I think. Really an incredible kind of step forward in terms of, in particular, a big firearm organization publicly saying, we care about suicide prevention. It's sort of the equivalent of the automakers saying, like, we have a role to play in drunk driving, for example, right? The gun is not causing the suicide crisis, but it plays a role in whether someone lives or not. And we don't want our community dying by suicide. And part of responsibility and being a responsible gun owner is being engaged in this space, and that's what we want to do. And they have continued to be very involved. This is the second iteration of their materials. And so you can see they're really trying to kind of have a brave conversation. This is like friends don't let friends drive drunk, looking out for your friends and so forth. I think was I telling you about Ladies' Night? No, I was telling somebody about Ladies' Night today. This was scarier than the TED Talk, I'm gonna be honest. Because this was early on when we were doing this work. I was invited to one of our big gun range partners, and they said, we have Ladies' Night every Thursday, which is not book club, so there's no alcohol. But women can come, and I think they get discounted time on the range, and it's only women, so it might feel more comfortable to some women to come practice firearm handling, and they can try out new guns and so forth. And they said, hey, we want to do a whole thing on suicide prevention. Will you come? And I said, of course I'll come. But I really didn't know how it was going to go, and I was, I just felt like I just was nervous. And then the owner of the range stood up and introduced me. Not quite as nice as your introduction, thank you. But he said all my talking points, basically. And coming from him, it was really impactful. And he was like, we need to talk about suicide. We can all play a role, et cetera, et cetera. And then I gave a very short talk. People asked really good basic questions like, is it okay to ask someone if they're having thoughts of suicide? Yes, it is okay to ask. But really some of the sort of basics of suicide prevention. And it just hit me that in public health, we were missing this whole population who needed these messages. These women might be at risk themselves, but they also, many of them have husbands at home and teenagers at home, and they can influence what's happening in that home environment. So it turned out, I was really nervous, but it turned out to be one of my favorite talks I've ever given. And so since about 2015, I've been building partnerships with gun shops, particularly in Colorado. It was really fun when NPR came out and did a story about us. And then we did like a training night for doctors who wanted to doctors who didn't know much about guns, who just wanted to come learn some basics. I don't think you need to know how to handle a gun to be able to talk about them, but for some people it helps kind of get over that like emotional hurdle if it feels really foreign to you. Okay, this next video, this one is about 2 or 3 minutes long. This is our latest program. So pausetoprotect.org is a program. This is funded by the Department of Defense. I'm going to talk more about it, but it's funded by the DoD through the Defense Suicide Prevention Office. The ultimate goal is to help prevent military suicides, but we're doing it by working with gun shops surrounding military bases. So we're already at 6 bases, and we'll be at 10 by August. And it's really, and just been so much, I don't know if fun is the right word, it's been pretty fun. To engage with these shops because they care about suicide prevention and they care about the military communities, and of course they want to help. And so we have created materials for them to use. And so this video is just around why secure storage matters for suicide prevention, but also for preventing theft, youth injury, and so forth. And it's from leaders in the firearms community who all donated their time. We had general talking points, but we didn't script any of this. And I want to play it because I just think it's helpful to hear it from them too, so it's not just from me. That makes sense.
The fact is, if we can promote secure storage and have people securely store their guns when they're not being used, it does create a safer community for everyone.
It's really important that this discussion about safe gun storage gets elevated because the issues at hand are becoming more significant over time.
Secure storage is the most important part of firearms ownership because it is the last line of defense when it comes to unauthorized access. When you think of unauthorized access, you think of people who should not have access to that firearm, period.
A lot of people hesitate to secure their firearms because they don't believe that they can access their firearm in the time of need very quickly, and that's just not the case. I know it's a cliche and we say this over and over again, but me as an educator, it's important for people to understand that education is important, not regurgitation.
I got into this business to save lives, to provide information and education, and to enrich lives the best way that I can. So for me, it's all about making sure we secure firearms so we're not causing a negative impact on good people and human lives around us.
A Girl in a Gun talks about secured storage a lot. It's one of our cardinal safety rules is to always keep unauthorized persons away from your firearms. It's very empowering and confidence building to give women the options available to them so that they can make the right decisions for their family. It's about safe storage.
And we have almost 4,000 employees, and not to mention the fact that we're providing firearms to soldiers, police officers, security forces in the US and all over the world. And so I think the importance of having a responsible position for safe gun storage is very important.
Firearm owners, by and large, are responsible people. They understand the responsibility of owning a firearm, and they take that responsibility very seriously.
The biggest role that gun stores can play is promoting that they actually have safe storage programs for regular citizens. We are a resource center. We're not just someone who wants your money. We're here to actually enhance and better your life.
I know it sounds a little corny, but if you have the people that you look at saying, or look up to, that you respect in the space saying, hey, safe storage is just important as you owning it in the first place, then they can look at you with some revere and say, well, you know what, if this ABC establishment is continually pushing this, and I go to them to be my local experts, then why wouldn't I listen to this expert advice?
There really doesn't have to be, or probably isn't, a roadmap to how you get involved. I think you just have to take that first step. You have to go out and look at some of these organizations that are providing options, and there's a number of different ways it can be done.
We want everyone to know all the options and make the right decision for their family.
I don't want to watch the news and think that because someone didn't buy a $40, $50, $60 safe, that now this family is going to go through 40, 50, 60 years of trauma.
The more that we contribute to the positive message of secure storage and we get gun owners to act on that, the better it is for the community as a whole.
So that video is on our Pause to Protect website if you're curious to see it again. And intentionally, it's not just about our program because we wanted it to be a sort of broader message. And you'll see the Pause to Protect website is also not actually about the military because, again, we were trying to build something broad. So I think all of that I've been talking about is really, in my mind, how do we make it normal? So this is really about normalizing secure storage. This is what responsible owners do. You're hearing this from lots of different people. How do we just make that part of the culture? But like I said, I think we got to also make it easy because human beings are sometimes lazy, honestly, and have busy lives and all of that. And so how do we remove any barriers to people for secure storage? So what does secure storage mean? This is especially for the non-gun owners in the room. There are lots and lots of ways to lock up a gun. And so I think the short answer is pick the one that works for your family and for you. And I don't need to tell you what that is because I don't know your situation. It might be a large safe if you've got a large collection. You know, for my father-in-law, he goes hunting once a year, so his is locked up in a safe. If you want quick access for personal defense of your home, you're probably gonna want one of these lock boxes. So the cable lock here, this is what's often given away for free at like all kinds of events. And we also give these away at some of our events. The downside to these is they require a gun to be unlocked to use it. So you can't have a bullet in the gun or a magazine in the gun to use that. So for someone who has a gun for home defense and they want quick access, and you can agree or disagree with whether that's a good idea, that doesn't matter. But if they want it for home defense, they're not going to use that cable lock because that's now making the gun useless for why they have it. But they might use a lockbox. And so this is where it really comes to helping people pick the thing that's right for them, helping them to understand why they have a gun and therefore what things they are open to. When someone has suicide risk, they should not have access to it. So that might mean changing the PIN, giving the key to somebody else, or ideally moving it out of the house. But there are lots of ways to store weapons securely. Somebody likens this to the vending machine, particularly when no one's watching you at the vending machine. What do you take? Right? So if the doctor's hovering over you, what are you going to choose? You might choose a healthy snack, but you really want, like, I don't know, the Twix bar is probably what I would pick. So we did one study asking people, if you were at, say, a community event and there were free devices, what would you take home? And also, if you had to pay, what would you be willing to pay? You don't have to read any of this. The take home is that it was kind of all over the place. People want different things, and that's okay. And so how do we think about, using almost like behavioral economics? If you give people choices and certain discounts, how can you encourage them to then actually take home the thing that they want to use? And so there's some work going on in that space right now as well. So I mentioned, though, that the safest thing to do, particularly for suicide risk, is really to take the gun out of the home. As an ER doctor, I would bump into this because sometimes, let's say somebody didn't have a close relative who they trusted to hang on to it, or they have a sister in town, but the sister isn't comfortable around guns. What is the option for them? And so we were really interested in how do we encourage out-of-home storage, meaning at a gun shop or at a police station, for example. So we created in Colorado back in 2018, I think, the first statewide map showing gun shops that are willing to store weapons for people. So the red are gun shops and the blue are law enforcement. I would tell you, this was a summer project. We had a student who just called a bunch of called every shop in the state and every law enforcement, and then we made a map. And then 8 other states made maps, and then it somehow made it into like a White House recommendation that there should be multi-state maps, and we were all like, this is really cool, but we don't actually know what it does yet. And there are a lot of questions around, will people actually use them? How do you make it easy for people to find this map to then find a shop and so forth? But the principle is like a drug take-back map. If you want to get rid of your prescription drugs, where can you actually take them to do it? We've done a lot of work on this since with some funding from the NIH, sort of trying to understand what are the barriers to gun shops doing this, and there are some liability concerns and space concerns and so forth. But it's now led to this, which is we now have a national map on our Pause to Protect website. The map was created in collaboration with a nonprofit called Pierce's Pledge that called every single gun shop in the country. These are shops that said they are willing to at least consider voluntary temporary storage for any reason. There may be shops that are willing to do it that aren't on here if they didn't answer the phone when we called, and certainly things change as well. But the idea here is that if you're a friend, if you're a family member, if you're a clinician, you could look up what's near your area and then be able to refer a patient there, or if it's your brother who you're worried about, say, hey, can we take the guns down to Joe's shop for a while you're getting better, to move them outside of the house. And in fact, we made a phone call today in one of my meetings, one of the local shops, and they also offer storage near here for $30. I think it was going to be for 2 guns. So it's an example where like that many of these shops, not all of them, because it depends on the space, but it's a service that they may offer, and it's another way of how do we make it easy for people to do this. The liability thing I mentioned, I'll just say now 3 states have passed liability protection laws. So the gun shops are worried about, how do I know it's safe to give the gun back to someone? What if I knew they were, so generally don't tell the gun shops why you're storing a gun. They don't want to know because it stresses them out if it's for suicide risk. Because how do they know it's safe to give the gun back? And so now 3 states, I think it's Louisiana, Montana, and Washington, have passed laws providing narrow liability protection for the gun shop. If they return a gun after temporary storage and the person subsequently dies by suicide, the gun shop can't be sued. Like, it's super narrow law. And in Louisiana, it was unanimous and bipartisan, which, like, when was the last time that ever happened? So anyways, there's a lot of interesting kind of work happening in this space. It's not going to be the right answer for everybody. We know from one survey about 25% of gun owners said they'd stored a gun away from home in the last 5 years. So it's not every weekend and it's not every person. But again, can it be one option we can offer people to make it easier? So this is the program, and then I have one last video, and then we're going to be pretty much done so we can do some questions. So the program that I mentioned, this is the DoD funded project, and it's really trying to make it easy for customers to pick the thing that's right for them. So we're trying to make it normal and easy for customers, but also for businesses. So the website has a whole suite of templates and resources and materials for the gun shops. If they want to offer storage, great, we'll tell you how to do it. If you just want to give out materials, great, we'll tell you how to do that too. And all of the materials are around that culture change, but also sort of making it easy. Here's where you can get things, here are the things you might like. And the woman in this video is the co-owner of a big shooting range in Denver, but now actually on our staff as well, working as the lead outreach person for this project, which is just a dream come true.
I opened my store about 9 years ago. I still love coming to work every day. But I don't just work here. I'm part of this community, and it's become part of me. It can be hard to talk about, but most of us have our share of stories about firearm misuse, from theft to injuries, even suicide loss. To know that my business can play a role to help protect our firearms and our community, it wasn't a question of why, but how. The resources from Pause to Protect make it easy for me and my staff to engage with firearm owners about the importance and options for secure storage. Members of our community have different reasons and preferences for storage. Someone's family might be growing, or maybe a service member or veteran is struggling. But most of us agree that as responsible firearm owners, we should prevent unauthorized access, which means our businesses and the people that are part of them, associates, instructors, gunsmiths, we can literally be the difference between life and death. Not a lot of small businesses can say that. Our communities support us every day. Why wouldn't we take this step to help protect them?
So I'll just, as a wrap up here, I'll say this is not where I thought my career was going. And it has been the most wonderful, creative, interesting adventure. And I think there's a lot of creative things happening here as well. I think finding this space where we can actually lean into tough conversations and find these shared common goals, build the science around it. These are federally funded projects with research questions, but also are deeply community engaged and community responsive. Is really just a dream come true. And unclear what the coming years are going to look like, honestly, because this is also a rapidly evolving field, even separate from kind of the larger things that we're all going through right now. But it has really taught me that there's so much that we can be doing together, and particularly in these divisive times, finding common ground with diverse stakeholder coalitions has just been such a joy and a balm, I think, for everybody on our team, because it reminds us that we actually all want the same thing at the end of the day, which is for our families and our friends to be healthy and safe. And so what I hope to see over the next coming years is that when it comes to firearms and firearm storage, we make it normal that you always store your gun securely so unauthorized people can't access it, like wearing a seatbelt, and that you check in and make sure people at risk don't have access to a gun, like a designated driver. But also that we make it easy and we can be smart about this and not just wag our finger at people, but actually help them make those safe and healthy choices. And most importantly, do it together. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Amy. We have time for some questions from the audience. Yeah, Francis, go ahead.
Full disclosure, I'm not a gun owner, but I was wondering, It seems like people will put their rifles in a nice gun safe, but then they'll keep a handgun in their nightstand for protection. So I don't think they get the irony. So is there any data that people do that?
So yes, you bring up a couple of points. We do know that many gun owners have more than one gun, and for multiple purposes. So that they might have long guns more often for like hunting that are stored in a safe, and then they have the one gun that they don't want to lock up as securely because it's in the nightstand for kind of quick access and protection. There are also people who have handguns, multiple handguns staged, as they say, sort of all over the house, ready for home break-ins. And so this is where what we're trying to really recognize is, so the suicide more often is with the handgun for kind of practical purposes. But there can be storage solutions for both of those. So the same way that you have the safe for your long guns because you know they're really locked up and safe and no one's going to steal them, also there are solutions for the handgun, and we want to encourage that behavior too. And I didn't mention, there's some really cool technology coming out, including around storage. So for example, a safe or a lockbox that will alert you if someone's trying to get into it, whether it's your kid or someone else, right? And it pops up on your phone. Like, a lot of the technology we're talking about here is nowhere near as savvy as the technology on our phones and everything else we use. And so, yes, did I answer your question? Yeah.
I hate to jump in, but I based on your answer there, I just want to ask a question I had. If it's
Yeah.
in terms of technology,
Yeah.
Are there any technologies out there being developed where the gun can recognize the owner? I can think about a variety of things that might work. There are a lot of smart guns things, such that if the gun were aimed towards the owner at close distance, it would be non-functional.
Okay, so yes to the first part. There is smart gun technology that either uses like a wristband you have to wear or a fingerprint reader. It hasn't taken off broadly for many reasons, some of them sort of legal, business kind of related, and also many people are concerned about it sort of not working in the heat of the moment, the same way sometimes your fingerprint on your phone doesn't work. I don't know of any that have restrictions on sort of the directionality of how it's pointed. But it's an interesting question, and like one that, right when we try to think about creative solutions, I hope someone is thinking about that.
Iris recognition, there are a lot of ways.
Well, and you know, for example, there are some who've talked about changing trigger strengths so that young kids, for example, couldn't pull them. Yeah.
Turn up. Anthony has
I'm wondering about across the means of suicide, the gun as the means. Guns have a particular violent attachment culturally, socially, narratively, versus some of the other means. And so I'm wondering if you go deeper into the individuals who choose a gun versus other means, is the violent connotation of the actual agent of death part of the psychological and psychiatric position? Because if that's the case, some of these interventions are still going to be helpful, but still that leaves on the table another dimension of the choice of the gun.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't have a perfect answer to it, but I have a couple thoughts. So one interesting thing is actually, I think there's some data that among among military service members who die by firearm suicide, it's almost always a personal weapon, not a service weapon, because there's a sort of sense of responsibility to their service weapon to not misuse it in that way, which I think is really interesting. One of the leading theories related to suicide and suicidality has to do with that you have to have kind of this like thwarted, like reduced sense that you belong. You sort of feel isolated and then feel like you're a burden, so that you truly believe, this is the other piece about suicide, that people truly believe the world would be better if they were gone. Like their disordered thinking at the time is that my family will be happy if I'm gone, and their family might say that's not true, but right. Those two things, but then also sort of the increased or the lowered threshold to die. And so some of that is access to means, but some of it is also willingness to go through pain. My understanding is that often there's a desire for sort of a quick or painless out as opposed to, but I don't know, this is a little bit outside of my space. So I think it's a really interesting question, sort of why do people choose the method that they choose? There's some interesting work happening from some other research groups looking at that actually the presence of a firearm may actually increase some impulsivity or decision to use firearms as a method. So I know I said that it doesn't, it's because of the lethality, but there is an increasing question of actually whether the presence of the gun makes you more likely to think about using it.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure, men are more likely, but I don't know how much of that is because also it's if there's a familiarity with it. So if it's the men are more likely to be firearm owners and actually know how to use it, as opposed to a woman who doesn't want to use it and then like survive an attempt. Does that make sense? So lots more to dig into for sure. Yeah.
So the question right here. If you pass the mic over, Brad.
Thanks for your presentation. It's great that your messaging around normalizing safe storage is reflective of the population that's disproportionately at risk for firearm suicide. I'm curious, when it comes to youth suicide, American Indian and Alaska Native youth are disproportionately at risk for suicide. I'm curious how, if you're working toward creating messaging toward that population, and if so, how are you making it culturally relevant for that group?
So, such a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. Our group, as of right now, is not, but others are, which I think is fantastic. And in particular, this wasn't youth per se, but there was a big project working with Alaska Natives around firearm suicide prevention, including lockbox, and they had like a handyman who would actually install the box in the home, and they talked about gun storage as well as medication safety, and it was developed entirely with community input and messaging the way it should be. And then somewhat similarly, there's a group that we work with in Denver now who traditionally their work is really focused on youth violence intervention, and so particularly typically young men of color who live in the urban area in Denver, kind of caught up in a cycle of violence. And what they're noticing is increasing suicidality among that population as well. So they're similarly now adapting messaging appropriate for that community, because it's not that guy. Yes. And you're totally right. This is where that's okay, that we need different messengers for different groups. And even what works in rural Colorado is not going to be maybe what works in the South. Or what works in rural parts of Oregon or Washington. So many of us are now trying to figure out how do we find sort of what the core messages are so that we're at least keeping those, like the click it or ticket or the buckle up, but then you adapt it in a way that feels appropriate to the community you're working with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, time for one more question over here. Then others can come up after.
Yeah.
How do you measure your... Get the mic so
Oh,
people...
I don't need
online.
Okay. How do you measure your report card?
Measure my report card. It's a great question. So any research related to suicide is inherently difficult because although suicide is a leading cause of death, it actually is relatively rare. And so to actually measure an impact on suicide death rates is maybe near impossible. So what we use is, in some of this work, we use markers around sort of attitudinal change, uptake, program participation. So the MAP thing, it's more about like how often are people using it. In some of the other work we've done, I didn't talk about today, we've done some work one-on-one with patients that's more around making decisions to reduce firearm access. And so the measures are more, do they feel more informed and ready to make that decision? And then at follow-up, have they done something to reduce firearm access? So we can't sort of wait for the outcome of actual suicide death because also your study would have to be so huge. And so we look for really locked storage as a marker. Yeah, good question though.
Please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank you.
Betz.